Well, welcome everybody, as I think we're going to have people starting to come online. Uh, I'll just give it a couple of moments because I think we've got quite a few people turning up today, which is fabulous. But as people are coming on board, I'd just like to say a big warm welcome to everybody who's joining us today on our data webinar, which is Recovery in Learning Abroad, Data Trends and Practitioner Insights. Now, this is our fourth and final IEAA data group webinar for 2025. And again, we have just been absolutely overwhelmed by the response and are so pleased to have so many attendees here with us today. And I know we've got possibly some new people because we've opened this up to a broader group of people. And so you're welcome, and it's so pleased to have you, as well as all those who have joined us in previous sessions as well. And it has really just been an honour this year as we've grown our data group webinars and having the attendance that we've been getting, which is brilliant. So hopefully as people are coming on board, again, I'll just say welcome. But we have a packed schedule today, so I am going to keep things moving. And firstly, I'd just like to, on behalf of IEAA, acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia from the many lands we are on today. And we acknowledge their continuing connection to land, waters, and community. We pay our respects to the people, the cultures, and the elders, past and present. So as I said, I've given a couple of welcomes. My name's Lyndall Jacker. I'm Future Student Insights Principal at UQ, but I'm also your host today as the chair of IEAA's Data Group, which is a subcommittee of IEAA's Research Committee. Now, I'm so delighted today to have the Australian Universities International Directors Forum, the AUIDF, participating in today's webinar. Now, learning abroad is a big part of how Australian universities connect with the world, and it's more important than ever for shaping Australia's global relationships. Today's session is all about giving you fresh insights into what's happening in this space using national data. Hence why we're here, and hearing directly from our incredible lineup of experts about the trends, challenges, and opportunities ahead. Now, before handing over to Christine Martin, Director of Global Engagement at Southern Cross University, and she's going to provide you a lot more detail about how it's going to run today, I've just got a couple of points to note, and that is to ask a question, please use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of the screen rather than the chat function. This allows others to see your question and to vote for it. And similarly, if you don't want to ask a question, but somebody's posted a question you'd really like answered, then please vote on that yourself. And as we normally do, we'll be recording the webinar and we'll be sharing this along with the slides early next week. So I'm going to come back on at the end of today, but now I'm going to hand over to Christine, who'll give us a lot more information about this exciting session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lyndall. And it's a privilege hi everybody. It's a privilege to be here with you today, and I'm coming to you today from our beautiful Lismore campus in the heart of the Bundjalung Nation. And today we'll be exploring the Australian Universities International Directors Forum benchmarking for learning abroad. As many of you will know, this is a long-standing collaboration between all the universities in Australia. It gives us really powerful insights into our outbound mobility. But this is really more than data. This is about us as a university community, sharing best practice, strengthening advocacy with our stakeholders, and also ensuring that Australian universities, most importantly, continue to create transformative global learning opportunities for our students. And I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but these experiences are really life-changing, and the ripples from the experiences sort of benefit our communities. And I certainly see that in my local community, but our communities here, but also around the world. So I suppose in today's data unpack, the positive news, and it's nice to have some positive news to talk about at this end of the year, is learning abroad is bouncing back. There are a few more complexities in there today, but we are seeing participation growing, and I'm really looking forward to unpacking that data today and getting into the detail with Keri and our wonderful panel that we've been able to bring today. Before we begin, I would like to do a bit of a shout out to our colleagues from all of the AUIDF. I would like to extend a really heartfelt thanks to the dedicated professionals who drive this benchmarking and make learning abroad opportunities possible across all of our universities and institutions. It is wonderful work, and it is work that is terrific to see this bouncing back. And I know the effort that goes into it. I know many of us are anticipating with bated breath NCP results. So I just want to take a moment to encourage the work that is being done collectively. I'd also like to give a special thanks to our panel of experts today, Professor Kent Anderson, Linda Russ, Keri Ramirez from Study Moves. They're leaders in our area, and sharing their insights today will be important. We will have some questions to answer to kick off the panel, but then there'll be an opportunity for everyone to ask questions as well in the Q&A. I'd like to also thank IEAA for their continued support in advancing Australian education, and particularly the important work that the data group does. So thank you very much. I'd like to now hand over to Keri so we can get into the data. I know everyone's really keen to get started on that. Thank you very much, Keri.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you to everyone for joining this session. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you, in particular because we know how important is learning abroad as part of the international education sector in Australia. In particular, very excited to be here today because I believe that this analysis that we're going to share with you today brings together two of the very important strengths that we have in international education here in Australia. I think historically, one of the unique aspects of the things that we do is that we have been seeking a balance in the sector. And in the same way that we are looking to provide opportunities and extraordinary experiences for students to come to Australia, to our campuses, we, for many, many years, have been looking to extend the benefits of international education and have Australian university students to also have the opportunity to travel abroad and enhance their degrees, be more employable, and help with many different aspects that are for the benefit not only of the students, not only of the universities, but actually in many ways of the nation. And the other reason why this is a very special analysis, as Christine mentioned, is because one of the unique aspects as well of the things that we do is that we collaborate together. I think that for so many years, that has been a tradition in the sector, that in general, institutions are looking for better ways in which we can improve our strategies. And this benchmark, the AUIDF benchmark of learning abroad, it definitely is a good example of how when universities share their information, share their data, we can actually improve our strategies. So today, I'm very pleased to share the main findings of the latest analysis of benchmark in learning abroad. And it's actually quite a comprehensive analysis. So we're just going to look for some specific points that basically tell the story of the sector in the last few years, but in particular in 2024. And the aim has been, in particular for us this year, as we have been developing this benchmark, to look for information, insights that help us just to bring the recovery on the student participation back to the levels that we had in 2019. In this year also, we were pleased to receive the support from 21 universities. And as Christine mentioned, we are very thankful for the time and the support given to this benchmark. All these 21 universities provide us with a very comprehensive data set on how students are actually engaging in learning abroad, where are they going, what type of programs are they undertaking, if they are getting funding, if they are getting credit for their programs. And that information has been extraordinary just to understand the state of the sector. But in some aspects, it was important just to get additional information from non-participants. And we also appreciate 11 universities that gave us some headline results that really help us just to continue with the timeline. Of course, we are hopeful that next year we'll have a larger participation. 2024 was an odd year and everybody had a lot of challenges. But as we actually move forward in the benefit of the sector, we will welcome a larger participation in this benchmark. Having said that, the data that it was collected, it was sufficient and relevant just to understand some key aspects of learning abroad. In particular, as you can imagine, the main topic that we are trying to analyze year by year is student participation. We really want to understand where students are going, what are the preferences, what is making learning abroad an effective way to connect with students. But on that, of course, we need to talk about the resources that each university is putting towards implementing learning abroad strategies. And I think that's one of the big topics, apart from the recovery, that we will actually have not only in this session, hopefully we'll have more conversations about it, because there is a clear difference about the level of resources that each university has at the moment to execute their learning abroad strategies. And when we talk about resources, of course, this is connected to the topic of funding that exists to support learning abroad. In this case, institutional funding, but also government funding. So we're going to talk about that briefly as well today. And finally, I'm also going to mention something that is extremely important, but also one of the great stories that come not only from the learning abroad sector, but I will say from the university sector, which is the support that is given to some equity groups, so they can actually, students in these equity groups also have the opportunity to take these extraordinary experiences and go overseas as part of their degrees. So starting with the data, as you can imagine, the main story of this year, and probably what we're going to focus mainly in this session, it's about the recovery. We know that learning abroad had some very difficult years, and it's great to see the recovery across the sector. But apart from the headline, it's important just to look at the detail on how this recovery has been experienced by the universities here in Australia. In this chart, I think this chart, if you want to frame it, basically tells you the story of learning abroad and student outbound mobility here in Australia. Back in 2009, and what you can see on the screen is the reported amount of experiences year by year by all the participating Australian universities. So back in 2009, we had about 15,000 experiences, so about 15,000 students going overseas to undertake these learning abroad experiences. And as you can see, the sector had an an extraordinary positive period of growth. And we reached in 2019 nearly 60,000 experiences. And what I think is quite interesting, and this is how I start the session, if you see this path of growth in outbound mobility, is very similar to the path of growth that we had in inbound. So back in those days, back before COVID, we were actually having the same levels of growth in students coming in, but also in students going out. And that's when it was a very interesting and important part of the sector to have that balance. Now, of course, when we had to deal with the challenges of COVID and we closed the border, everything actually changed. And unfortunately, learning abroad was one of the areas in the university sector that was affected the most. This is very well documented. but a lot of learning abroad teams were actually taken away, or their resources were actually taken away because it was basically the challenge that everybody was dealing. And since there, universities little by little have been rebuilding, and with that rebuilding has been the recovery and student participation. In 2023, universities report about 34,000 strategies, and I'm very pleased to report that this year we have seen it grow again, and we are reaching now 43% experiences in 1 year. This includes the participation of the 21 participating universities, but also the 11 non-participating universities. It's pretty much everybody. The universities, just to let you know that were unable to participate at all, they basically acknowledge that they have very, very small numbers, which in many ways reflects where we at in this recovery. We actually had some universities that actually reaching the levels of participation that they had in 2019. We have other group of universities that they are still in the rebuilding space, and other group of universities who are basically back to square zero, which this data analysis and this opportunity to collaborate, it means a lot more, because that's when we can actually bring back everybody into the same page. Now, overall, a significant growth year by year. It was a 25% growth. And for the first time, we saw that the majority of universities, 75%, actually reported growth year by year. But as I said, even there are different levels of growth and different levels of recovery that are important just to acknowledge when we see at these aggregate numbers. And also, it's very, very important also to acknowledge that we are not quite here. We are at 74%, the levels that we had back in 2019. And this is when this report, I think, is quite interesting, because this is when everybody can drill down and understand how everybody has been able to recover, the different resources that everybody has, so we can actually learn from each other, so we can actually bring back learning abroad to the levels that we had in 2019, or even beyond those levels. But a very important part of this story, and probably something that actually I really, really congratulate the learning abroad sector. Each time that I talk to practitioners in this sector, this is one of those areas that is exciting, and I think everybody should be very proud of. Very early, I have learned that in learning abroad here in Australia, nobody gets left behind. And the universities have been showing this recovery, but they also have been still putting the effort on bringing this access to learning abroad to these student equity groups. As you can see on the screen, especially if you see the aggregate of 2023 and the aggregate of 2024, in the majority of these student equity groups, we actually had a growth once again, which I think shows that at the same moment that we are seeking this recovery, we still have that important priority of bringing learning abroad to every single student that we have in our communities. What is also extremely interesting to see, and one of those great stories that come from the report this year, is that even when in 2024 we had a lower number of participants, 21, in comparison to 2019, that we had 34, we're actually, with less universities reporting, we're actually reaching the levels in some of the student equity groups, like our First Nation students and students with disabilities. We actually are getting high levels of participation. In fact, this year, the report basically highlights that 1 in 5 graduating students, First Nation students, are actually undertaking a study experience. So as you can imagine, the impact that these experiences have to them as individuals, to their families, and to community, and the benefits that that brings to the university sector and the society are enormous. And that's great to see that learning abroad in this part of recovery are still putting the effort in bringing access and equity to everyone. Now, in terms of the choices made by students, there are a lot of learning that we can actually get from the data that it was presented today in this benchmark. There are a lot of information that comes from the benchmark, but I just want to focus on 3 main areas. We want to talk about the destination, where students are going, the type of experiences that the students are choosing and universities are actually offering. And also, I'm going to talk about the duration of the programs. There are a lot of experiences or learnings from this because in many ways it helps us to understand how learning abroad has been shaped here in Australia and what it could be the next steps to recovery and what are the challenges that probably universities are facing in this part of recovery. In terms of destination, if we see the top destinations, and this is the aggregate across all the participating universities, as you can see, China is the preferred study destination in 2024, followed by the UK and the US. I do need to acknowledge also that based on the 21 participants, China actually is actually universities that they have a high engagement with China. And for that reason, we actually had a higher proportion of students who actually were reported as their destination. Historically, it's about 14%, but is still, and it has been for in 2023 and in previously since 2019, one of the top destinations chose by Australian students. What I think is also interesting out of this particular chart is the fact that, as you can see, the top destinations where students are undertaking these international learning experiences are in the Asia Pacific region. This is quite a unique feature that we can see in Australia. There is not a lot of information from other countries, but we know that, for example, in the US, they have probably a higher preference to go to Europe, and for Europeans, probably to stay in Europe or going to North America. But definitely in Australia, all the efforts made by institutions and governments are really changing the preference of the students to engage with the region. And as we know, this is the region where probably we'll see a higher impact in the experience of the students, in where universities actually would like to see students to go, but also where the government in particular would like students to go. So this actually confirms that Asia Pacific is in many ways the preferred option for students. And what it has been also quite interesting to follow is in this story of recovery, it has been great to see that the recovery also has been seen in the participation in pretty much every single destination. As you can see, North Asia had a significant growth, Europe has significant growth, the same of Oceania, South Central Asia. But I think it's also important to highlight that the only region where this year we haven't seen that growth is in Southeast Asia. And it's important to highlight this, and we will drill down and to look into why is this the case, because we know that Southeast Asia is one of the priorities. Maybe it's actually the priority region for the Australian government. So it's important for us just to look close into the data and understand what's happening in this particular region or what it can be done so we can actually have higher levels of recovery in student participation in Southeast Asia. Now, moving away from the destinations, I like to just to spend a little bit of time in something that is important just to understand, and taking the opportunity that this particular webinar covers not only learning abroad practitioners, but a wider audience. It's just important to highlight the type of experiences that Australian university students are taking. It's probably a common thing to believe that the students, when they go abroad, they just go for the traditional semester abroad. In fact, it was only 19% of students who participate in what we can call a traditional semester and exchange semester abroad. Something that is actually more common in the distribution that we see here in Australia is that about 20% of students, what actually they do is an internship or a work integrated learning experience, which is once again one of those very interesting strengths in the learning abroad sector here in Australia, because we have noticed that the strategies in many ways are also a link to provide more employability and more skills for the labor market for our students. So as a result of that, as you can see, 1 in 5 students, what they do is actually an internship or a work integrated learning aspect of it. And this connects on how learning abroad participates and links with the overall university mission, and definitely employability is one of them. But the other one, which is interesting, and in fact, it was the most common type of experience reported by universities, is faculty-led study tours, which I think also shows how important it's going to be, and it has been, to connect learning abroad across the complete university community. 35% of these experiences were faculty-led, which means that the support given not only for an international office or the actual learning abroad teams is not only relevant, but it's also relevant to get the support from the complete university environment. 1 in 3 students actually participate under these faculty-led study tours, and this is a complete set, as you can see. So we have 7% going to a conference and 3% doing what is called a research experience. So very interesting that also in the way in which we're engaging in learning abroad is quite unique in our opinion, and it shows that it's very important just to have that comprehensive commitment across the universities to actually continue the recovery of learning abroad. Now, in terms of the type of experiences, another big thing that is quite unique for learning abroad in Australia is the duration of the programs. In many other parts of the world, students tend to go more for that traditional 6 months. Here in Australia, we actually, most of the students, and this year BLA actually confirms this, because the majority of the students, they actually go for a shorter duration. What we categorize as a short duration is any experience that is basically less than 12 a week. In contrast, it's only 16% of the students that they go for 1 trimester or 1 semester, and then actually we have very few that go for a year or longer than that. Now, this particular part of the analysis, and you will see it when you see the national report, it has been quite important to follow. And in fact, universities ask us just to expand the categories in what is called short duration. And it was an important change because, as we know, it was a change in the guidelines of New Colombo Plan. So universities were really trying to understand the impact in how the change in the guidelines in New Colombo Plan may impact student participation. And when we actually look at more detail about in this short duration, as you can see, we actually had a large number of students, 64%, that, at least in 2024, participate in less than 4 weeks, which means that it's a large group of students that may be affected with this transition to the new guidelines. And I think it's important for universities. I know you are fully aware of this, but it was very important just to actually get the number and to see which kind of students may be affected by this. And on that, this takes us to the very important aspect, which is the funding of learning abroad. It was great to collect a lot of information in this particular area and to confirm that nearly 60% of the students who went abroad in 2024 require some sort of funding. Funding is such an important part on student participation, and for that reason, we're actually putting a closer look and a closer analysis just to understand what kind of students are requiring this funding and what kind of funding is available. And in the report, we actually look at 3 main sources of funding. We look at government funding, we look at institutional funding, and we look at private funding. And it's just interesting in terms of the recovery, how also this is connected definitely to funding. The big aggregate story tells a positive story because in comparison to 2023, now there is more institutional funding available. It was an increase of 15%. And also, more students in comparison to 2023 receive an experience that had an institutional funding. But I think what is important to highlight is that this funding that it was available is still very limited to only a few institutions. In fact, from the $16.7 million reported in aggregate by universities, 50% of that 16 millions is just in a handful of universities, about 4 universities that offer that amount of funding. And we know that one of the challenges that the sector is facing is how to bring that recovery and how to bring those institutional funding back, which we know it has been quite challenging for universities because, let's face it, it has been a pretty complicated couple of years. But as we move forward, it will be interesting just to see how we can actually rebuild those sources of funding. Now, in terms of government funding, and I just want to also be clear in here, this is the allocated government funding for across a university sector. And this includes not only New Colombo Plan, includes OS Helps, includes scholarships available from the government. We also have seen an increase. It was only an increase of 5% from $58.6 million going to 61.6. And here, the interesting part of the story is that what we saw a decrease is in the amounts reported on OS Helps. And this is because, as probably you remember, in 2024, we had a cost of living crisis, we had high interest rate, which in many ways obviously made students just to double think the use of OS Help. And that unfortunately affect the additional allocation of funding. The good news is, at least on the interest rate front, this is actually changing. So most likely we'll see that the levels of OS Help will come back. And briefly, we look also into the actual number of students who receive NCP mobility grant. And this was very important because this, as we know, is a group of students that may be affected in the next year or next years with a change in the guidelines. So as you can see, it was about 6,000 students that receive an NCP mobility grant. The big question that we had across the sector is what can we expect in 2025, which we know it will be not only NCP for 2025, there are other years that are involved in here, but it will be interesting just to think about how this number could maybe be flat or maybe decrease in the next couple of years. So universities are aware of this and look for ways in which they can actually do the transition, maybe increase in institutional funding or provide additional support. So the overall number on student participation actually keeps increasing as we wish it will happen in the next couple of years. Now, finally, just to give you the complete look, this is the historical trend on the amounts in millions reported in institutional funding. We're still at 56% the levels that we had in 2019 and 50% the levels in the government funding. I acknowledge that year by year, there is a difference because different universities are participating, but we are comfortable probably just to say that maybe we're still below, well, definitely we are below the levels in 2019, but maybe what about the 40%, the level of institutional funding and the same of the allocated government funding. So it seems that this is going to be one of those critical topics that we need to address in the next couple of years and months so we can actually continue the support of learning abroad. So as you can imagine, this was just a few highlights of something that it's a very comprehensive report. But basically what the data is suggesting this year is that as we're recovering, the student demand is also coming back. We also need to remember that we had years of basically no students going abroad. So as more students are actually participating in learning abroad, we're going to see that more students come back, share the story, and that's bringing some traction to universities. But definitely one of the areas is that although institutional investment is recovering, this is not necessarily the case of every single universities, and we still see that universities are in a different stage as we progress in this recovery. And finally, I think that, as you know, we don't want to take the pedal out of the metal. We're still far from the 2019 levels. So it's a great story to see that we are recovering, but definitely, as we all know, there is work to do. And I know in particular practitioners of learning abroad, they really, really want to see this happening because they know and understand the benefits of learning abroad. not only for students, but also for universities, and as I said, for our communities as well. And on that, it has been extraordinary to see that this recovery, it has been inclusive and looking at the benefits that will bring to the complete community in the universities. So on that note, I will stop it here, and I'm looking forward just to hear from the expert panel and also hear from your comments and questions that you may have. And I'm just going to bring it back to Christine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keri, and thank you as always for your wonderful insights into the data. I'd like to now open up to our panel, and I'd first of all like to direct a question to Kent. As we've seen, Kent, we're on a recovery, but there's quite a bit of detail under the bottom of that, and I'd really like to ask you around why is it important that we continue to grow participation in learning abroad from a sector perspective, particularly at the moment. And then if you could talk a little bit about how universities could start to grow or build their, any tips, or I'm curious to know any advice you might give to institutions, given we've got a high number of practitioners around in the current climate with some of those constraints that Keri's talking about. Any advice, given you've really been instrumental in growing some learning abroad programs over the years. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Christine. I'm on Kulin Nation today, and we're just going into the kangaroo apple season. So I hope whatever season it is, wherever you are, is wonderful, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that to everyone and to those special places that you hold. First, can I just really congratulate AUIDF for doing this? It is the most powerful tool for changing policy is hard data and data evidence. We know that it's been seen, every single policymaker in Australia will now say they're data-driven policymaker. So this data is critical if you ever want to move policy one way or the other. So real shout out to AUIDF and a shout out to Keri and his team for pulling this together. On your first point, which is why do we need mobility? Look, when I got in this game, like probably almost every person on this call, I did it because learning abroad transformed my life. As a country kid, I'd never been abroad. I had to get a passport and all of that, and it changed who I was. So that's what I would call the transformative argument. I've given up using that as part of the persuasive tactic. Because if you're saying transformative and it sounds like it's a little bit of an add-on for someone who's got a whole bunch of money and they can do it on the side. I've given up that. Instead, the argument I use is the academic benefit from learning abroad. Learning abroad is the single intervention that an institution can do that will increase retention, quicken time to graduation, improve academic outcomes, and it has more impact the greater at risk the student is. So low SES, Indigenous, disabled, all of those, they have all of those positives, but more than for it. So when you're talking with government, when you're talking with a deputy vice chancellor academic, when you're talking with a dean, if they want more students to graduate on time and they're particularly concerned about equity, the answer is simple. The evidence is absolutely clear. Learning abroad does it. And again, for that assertion, I rely on the CASI data, and people have heard me talk about that in the past. So that's easy. But going to your second question about what do we need to do more of, the first is, remember I said evidence matters. Guys, I don't know how many of the people on this are from an institution that didn't report, but shame on you. And shame on us as friends for not smacking them upside the head to get on the bus. You've got to do that. It's just, I'm in the ATN. I'm proud that all 6 of my universities participated. Could Uni of SA say, look, it's a really busy year, we're not going to do that? They could have. but they went and did the hard yards for all of our benefit. And so can I just really underline that? Thank you to the 21 that did, but really for the others, we got to get on board, guys. I'm sorry. This is first point. Second point is, look, Keri covered this. We were smashing it in 2019. We really have come off that. And we need to do a bit more. The one I worry about most is actually the equity. We've halved the number of equity students from low SES and first and family. It's great that we've kind of stayed pretty even on Indigenous, and we've actually had an uptick on disabled. But for low SES and equity, we're half where we were in 2019. So I think we need to do some specific focus on that. I have an assertion that we're at peak exchange, and I would even guess peak faculty led. Those ones aren't going to grow that much more because of, but lots of reasons I can go into. But that means we need to focus on those internships, focus on those third-party provider destination-led programs, and look at the data that Keri's presented. Half of our universities have TNE campuses overseas. 0%, zero, are actually moving campus to campus. And yet we tell the government and everyone, we've got this campus over there so we can facilitate our students to get, it's bullshit. Okay, so those are the three I would focus on. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Ken, and really wonderful. And I like that terming of it, as an intervention. I think that's a really powerful way for us to kind of advocate within our institutions. And sort of staying on that theme, Keri, it was great you unpacking that headline around the funding increasing and sort of unpacking that. And I'm curious to know a little more, we are seeing that funding overall increase, and again, it's sort of steady, not a sharp increase, but important that it's heading in the right direction. I want to know around, what does the data tell us about inclusion of underrepresented students? Sort of picking up on the point there that Kent's talking, they're the group that we probably need to bring into focus over the next 18 months. So anything that you're picking up from that data that we can sort of start to pull out and put into practice?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. And I will follow the comments from Kent about how important it is just to get evidence in this space. That really helps just to have a more meaningful conversations about campuses. And in this particular topic, it was just something that we assumed that students in these equity groups will require more support or more funding, but it's good to have a number that backs that up. Based on the information that it was provided by universities, for example, 76% of our First Nation students require funding. That compares to about 50 that they're not First Nation. So obviously shows that clearly that require additional support and funding, but having that number is extremely useful. And probably moving away from the benchmark, but in something that covers the data that it's available, one of the things that the examples that I find is fascinating is what University of Tasmania has done with a program called UniGo. It's an excellent program that brings and supports students from an access and equity point of view. And what they have done, because I was very lucky to be in a presentation given by them at the IEAA Learning Abroad Forum, that, by the way, what a great event. I think everybody should actually go to that because it was a great opportunity from learning from each other. But they explain us how they're backing that the benefits of those programs with those students with data. They are basically showing what Ken was explaining, how students have better retention, they academically perform better, they actually engage even more in learning abroad, like they have a high level of people returning from those programs and going to seek other larger or longer duration programs. So having that evidence-based or data-driven conversation is paying off, is definitely paying off for them. And I think that's probably one of the areas that we could actually put together more in the learning abroad environment to help us just to talk across the campuses and to get the commitment that we need.
Thank you, Keri. And I might switch. We've spent a little time on that side now, and I might switch tack a bit now and Linda, bring you into the conversation. So it was interesting. I'd like to talk a little bit more about what are the factors that you see are influencing where students are going, because that's important as well. And I note that dip in Southeast Asia, and that's somewhere that we're all sort of focusing in on at the moment, looking, and also as we're thinking about where we're going with our global strategies. Certainly, Southeast Asia is an opportunity that we're all looking to. So, just interested to get your importance on how could we maybe reinvigorate that interest from our students in going there, and any other insights on where our students are going.
Yeah, student demand is kind of a really interesting area to look at. And I think there's a lot of factors that sort of drive student interest in destinations because that can be a bit tough to pin down. I certainly always enjoy doing my shift at Open Day to hear kind of where these high school students come in with their parents and what countries and destinations they're asking about. And I have to say, from my 3 hours at the desk, I had about 70% of inquiries about Europe and the UK, probably about 20% about the US, and maybe 2 or 3 about Japan. So that was a really interesting look into kind of where high school students are thinking about when they kind of hit university or before they get to uni. I definitely don't think that funding always drives demand. So that doesn't always attract students to destinations. I think anyone who's worked in a learning abroad office has had the experience of having grants for a destination and not being able to find a single student who wanted to go there. So I think funding doesn't always let you build it, and they don't always come. But that said, funding can be kind of a key decision factor for a big group of students, particularly from a widening participation background. I think sometimes destinations are related to students' discipline area. We all know there's students who want to work in finance and want to go to London or New York. And demographics can also play a huge part. We've certainly seen the drop off of female students wanting to go to the US, for example, because they don't feel safe there. So that can really drive it. And again, it could be driven by what's going on in pop culture. We've certainly seen an explosion in South Korea due to K-pop and K-dramas. So, that can really drive it as well. And obviously, sometimes it can be like that one key passionate academic in a classroom who's really making an impact on their cohort of students and getting them to go to a certain destination. I think when you swing around to the Southeast Asia question, it's obviously always been a popular destination for like the study tours, for a study tour model, because I think in my experience, it's always been a bit of an issue getting students to undertake longer term, more immersive experiences in Southeast Asia. Potentially, it can be around, perhaps students see it as a place to go as a holiday and not necessarily as a study experience. The lack of language education, particularly in the high school, moving on to university, we've seen languages drop off in particular, and Southeast Asian languages has dropped off hugely over the years. And also, I guess, students want to tend to go in a study tour cohort because they feel more comfortable. So I think some of it might be an education piece for students about the value of Southeast Asia as a destination. It can be hard to convince students. For example, we see quite a few students coming and going, I want to go to London. It's been my lifelong dream to spend my semester in London. It can be difficult to change their mind to thinking about Thailand, because sometimes it's hard enough to even get them out of going to London and to another part of the UK. So it's really about that education piece and how do we direct students' attention to Southeast Asia. And part of that may be directing funding. There's a lot of evidence like the UniGo program about introducing short-term options in Southeast Asia early on in a student's degree, which, may lead to them choosing Southeast Asia for a longer-term experience later in their degree. The problem is obviously whether institutions are able to fund these shorter term experiences for students, particularly without the NCP funding that has enabled these shorter term experiences previously. Obviously, building these into the curriculum would be the best practice, but you really need that buy-in of senior leadership and selling the value of learning abroad in the curriculum, as Kent said earlier, in terms of retention and a whole host of other reasons.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Linda, and those insights. And I think, that I heard from you that sort of starting early is particularly important, and that reflection of speaking with students at open day and high school, and how do we start to influence that. It also sounds like we probably need a little more data on this particular question around Southeast Asia, and it's probably a bit of a watch for us on how we are in the next survey that we do next year, and how 2025 looks with the impacts of funding. But also, I think it's a really valid point that it's not always the funding, it's what are those other factors. Thank you very much. We might open now. I can see we've got a number of questions, and we've got about 10 minutes left to go. So we've had a question here from Natasha. Keri, I think this one's for you. When we look at China as a top destination for students, do we have data on the percentage of students who were Chinese students looking to return back to China, or Chinese students leveraging strong university partnerships with high-ranked institutions that might be drawing our students from China back? Insights there.
Yeah, I wish I had the data, but unfortunately, the report is not covering that extent. We know that there is an important number of international students, which we assume are Chinese students, who they do go back and take that experiences. But it's very diverse, really, the destination China. So at the moment, I don't have, to be honest, that level of insights just to make a claim about it. I don't know if Linda, probably you have some insights here from what universities are telling you.
Yeah, and I think there are a certain proportion of Chinese nationals who come to Australia for a full degree and want to go back to China to perhaps do an internship or a placement, because obviously that would contribute to their resume for when they do eventually potentially go back to China after their degree and want to get a job. Having industry experience in China is really relevant for them. And we also see a lot of short-term experiences in China as well for students who want to maybe go back and do a summer school in China. I think with the semester study, we don't see a lot of Chinese students going back, and that's mainly because Chinese institutions don't allow semester study by Chinese students. So it is in that shorter term space. And I think it is certainly relevant to them to gain that experience on their resume for when they do go home and want to work in the future and move on. But we certainly see a lot of non-Chinese students also wanting to go to China. It is one of the top destinations as well. So it's not just driven by Chinese nationals wanting to go back.
Agree.
Christine, just one word on this. I spent a fair amount of time digging through the research literature, trying to find if you could identify whether there was a bigger or a lesser impact with cultural difference. So if I'm an Anglo-Australian who goes to the UK, versus an Anglo-Australian going to Papua New Guinea, is there a difference in experience? So if I'm a Chinese heritage student going to China, is there a difference if I'm I couldn't find any research that suggested the cultural difference in culturals was correlated with it. I think the common sense thing is it should be correlated, but can I just caution people about making too much on that assumption, because it's not supported by the data. If someone has more recent data, I'm happy. My efforts in that were about 5-10 years ago.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And I think that's a good point as well. We probably need more data in that, and also maybe don't rush to those assumptions as well. This one, I think, Linda, I might come to you. How has the increase in faculty-based programs, short-term programs, work-integrated learning, impacted job design and workloads for mobility teams? So interested if we could get a short comment from you and from a practitioner's point of view.
Yeah, and I think this has been different across different institutions, because I think the key thing is learning abroad teams at different universities are structured so differently. At my university, we don't look after faculty-led programs centrally, but it's had a huge impact on the faculty teams and how they're resourcing that, and particularly, the ability of academics to take groups overseas. I've certainly seen at other institutions there's been a rise of professional staff accompanying groups overseas, study tours, and that's kind of an area that, in the past, professional staff didn't really get involved with. But, the administrative workload of running a study tour is so high that it is something that we've had to kind of turn a hand to as well. So yeah, it's definitely had an impact on workloads because those types of experiences are a lot more administratively heavy than some of the other experiences that we send students on.
And there is another question here, and I think this might be a discussion that we could perhaps pick up, maybe in our sector discussions, but the importance of faculty-led programs. Is the panel aware of any successful models from a more centralised support? So that might be something, maybe not for this panel today, but I think it sounds like we're all thinking about how do we make some of these programs work better from a centralised point of view. Don't know if anyone had any further comment on that.
Look, I do have one comment, and I see Brad Doherty has put something in. I was a dean. It's really hard for me to sign off on the workload for an academic to do that. I understand, I'm a passionate supporter, so I understand why I would do it from that. But from a workload perspective as a dean, it's very hard. So I can do a couple, and I can write a couple into my budget. Whatever, my faculty, I'll do 5 in summer and 5 in winter or whatever. It's very hard for me to do more than that, which is why I think we really need the third-party providers who are finding the scale to do it at a price point that is accessible for our students. So I do think you can scale it, but I think you need to use things like third-party providers.
It's a great point. And I might go to Brad's point. So do we have any insights or feedback on what institutions are doing to future-proof themselves from what the universities are predicting to be a significant decline in enrolments from the Asia Pacific and other groups from 2026 onwards?
I can just provide some insights before you go, Linda.
Yeah, go for it,
Just
Keri.
a few of the data points. I think Linda can tell us more about what universities are doing. But what it has been extremely useful from the data that it was collected is just to understand the characteristics of each destinations, like in particular, like Oceania, and how difficult is just to provide experiences that have longer durations, like a semester, or obviously like anything that is above 12 weeks is extremely hard. And the number, I think, was minimum. I think it was 3% of students who went to Oceania, in particular, the Pacific Islands, participate in a semester program. So I think that when you see that the implication and the difficulty to transition to a guideline that gives or pushes for longer experiences, it is challenging. It is challenging, and I think the data suggests that. But I think it's going to be interesting, really, to see what universities can do on that space, and that's when Linda, I think, can give us more insights about it.
Yeah, it is interesting because we won't see the knock-on effect of the NCP reforms even in the 2025 data set. There's still a lot of funding hanging around from 2024. So we're not going to see these reforms really impact us until 2026 data comes through. So that'll be interesting when that comes through. And I think it'll be interesting to see the effect on kind of the widening participation cohort then, because I suspect it will mean we'll see a huge drop in the number of students, those students taking part in experiences. And I mean, I guess from a university perspective, one thing that can be done is how can universities swing, any funding that they do have for mobility towards these experiences that aren't being funded by the NCP? Is there any way that because I think in the past we've tended to push funding more towards a semester model, thinking that those students are going for a longer time and need more funding. But potentially, is it the fact that the students going for these shorter term experiences might need that funding more because it will hit that widening participation cohort? So yeah, just a thought.
Good observation there. And I do know that we're close to the end. I might just ask Ken, did you have any final observations and then we'll close out.
Sorry, just I'm on mute. Just on the one challenging the question about using campuses overseas. So it's in the data page 19, but I'm sure Keri would share it as well. It's important to note that The median university is 0% and the average is 1%. But still, I would argue when our universities went to the government asking for more NOSC places, those with campuses overseas talked about how it's this great exchange. Um, in all six of my universities, the A10 we have 12 campuses overseas. So we're very proud about this, but I still think, and I saw someone from Singapore post in the comments, I still think we're underusing those campuses as outbound destinations. And my point is, if you want to use scale, you can't just get more and more exchange and more faculty led. So things like using those campuses is actually what has to be done. And we're talking a good game, but it's not coming through in the data, even if you have one or two anecdotes that you can see, that you can talk about.
Yeah, and just on that, it was actually only two universities that actually presenting that proposition, and they are doing really well. They're using their campuses abroad, and they're getting good participation levels. In one in particular, really good participation levels using that structure, which makes complete sense, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you both, Keri and Ken, for that. And I think you've left us with a good challenge there to go back and think about that a little further and what we could do in that space. I do know that we are now at time, so I'd like to thank all of the panel here today and also thank everyone again for participation in this important survey and wish everyone a very Merry Christmas. I'd like to hand back now to Lyndall to close us out for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you to this esteemed panel. I think fabulous discussion. We saw all the questions, and this is exactly what we want from these type of, when we have these webinars. It's getting the conversation going. So again, I cannot thank you enough. And as a reminder, the recording and the slides will become available next week. Now, just before closing off, I just want to say a reminder that we've got the IEAA National Symposium in February next year, which will be held in Melbourne, and it's on a very topical subject around partnerships for the future. So I recommend registering for that ASAP because this event has sold out in recent years. So, and it's a great way to kick off the year and discussion, particularly more around policy and strategy. And until then, exactly as Christine said, I'm wishing everybody a well-deserved break from what has been another big year in international education, whether it's learning abroad or coming on, to Australia onshore. And I'd love to say stay tuned for what our IEAA DataNet webinars are going to look for next year. So anyway, again, thank you, everyone.